All right, today we're going to talk about imperialism in the United States and Japan. Now, as European powers colonized Africa and Asia, the United States mostly just stayed in the Western Hemisphere. They were invited to the Berlin Conference, but didn't really participate because they didn't really have any interests in colonization of Africa. But they were concerned about the Americas, especially Latin America. Latin America had continued to rely on exports of raw materials to mostly European countries. So they sent those raw materials to countries in Europe in exchange for lots of money. And they tried to use that money to build up their economy. However, many of the governments in Latin America were corrupt and unstable. And the Americans feared that as they were unable to pay back those loans and the money from Europe, that Europe might eventually invade and to reclaim some of those colonies. So way back in 1823, President James Monroe made a public declaration called the Monroe Doctrine that said the American continents were not subject to colonization by European powers. He was trying to ensure stability for the entire American continents so that the United States wouldn't be disrupted either. And this really remained untested until 1878 during the Spanish-American War. Cuba, which had been a Spanish colony, tried to declare its independence, and in response, the Spanish government went to try and stop the rebellion. And the United States had a lot of business holdings in Cuba, and so in 1898, the U.S. declared war against Spain to try and make Cuba independent. As a result of the war, Cuba was declared independent, but instead of actually having its own government, the United States sent in the military to run the government in Cuba to ensure American business interests were unharmed. The United States did the same thing in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam, which had all been Spanish colonies. So the United States, through the Spanish-American War, gained a whole lot of colonies and protectorates that they used to protect American business interests. Next, the Americans looked south to Latin America, and specifically Panama. The Isthmus of Panama is the thin piece of land that divides the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. And there was always hopes since the beginning of the 19th century to build a canal that would connect the two sides. France had tried it, but because construction was too difficult, they eventually abandoned it. But the Americans were particularly interested in trying to secure access to this canal. So in 1904, the United States paid $10 million to the Colombian government, which controlled Panama, to start rebuilding the canal from where the French had started. And they worked for a while, but eventually the Colombian government started to ask more money from the United States. In response, the United States government called for Panamanian independence, and soon a revolt broke out in Panama, and after a few years with American support, Panama gained its independence. And in return, Panama gladly finished building the canal for the United States, which then claimed total control and ownership of the canal. To argue in favor of this, President Theodore Roosevelt added to the Monroe Doctrine what was later called the Roosevelt Corollary. That said the United States had the right to be an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. And you'll see really throughout the early 20th and into the remainder of the 20th century, the United States exercised a lot of control and authority over countries in Latin America, again, mostly in favor of American economic interests. And as America gained holdings in the Pacific, they started to look for other places they could potentially take control of. And the next place they looked to was Hawaii. Hawaii had been settled around 1200 by Polynesian peoples. And the Hawaiian Islands were unified in the 1700s. And through that age of exploration, most European and Western powers recognized Hawaii's independence. The Hawaiian monarchy, which was a constitutional monarchy, allowed a lot of American businessmen to set up shop in Hawaii. They allowed them to purchase property, to grow sugarcane, which is extremely valuable. But the problem for the sugarcane growers was that because Hawaii was its own independent nation, they had to pay an import tax, a tariff, to the United States to sell their sugar there. So the growers tried to force Hawaii to accept American rules so they wouldn't have to pay that extra tariff. The queen at the time, Queen Liliuokalani, was resistant to the demands of the growers and trying to negotiate with them, but in response, the plantation owners organized a coup with American help that eventually overthrew Queen Liliuokalani. The plantation growers, led by Sanford B. Dole, the same guy who started the Dole Banana Company, declared Hawaii a republic, and then a few years later had it annexed to the United States, making it a territory. So, as you can see, most of the American imperialism that we see in the late 19th and early 20th century was mostly for American economic interests, not necessarily the same kind of territorial gains that you see European powers have in Africa and across Asia, but much more focused on business and trade. And the one other area we want to talk about with imperialism is Japan. Now, last time we had looked at Japan, Japan has been in its closed country era. Since the 17th century, the Tokugawa shogunate resisted any kind of European influence. They didn't like missionaries, they didn't like too much European trade, and so they had set this policy that totally cut off Japan from the outside world. No Japanese were allowed to leave the islands, and trade was restricted to only the Chinese and the Dutch, and that was in a single port. And as European powers had looked more to China for trade, the United States decided to try and force Japan to open trade. So they sent Admiral Commodore Matthew Perry with an expedition to try to open negotiations with Japan. And he did so really through force. He brought with him a large fleet of warships to try and demand the Tokugawa shogunate open trade. And the Tokugawa shogunate did open up trade to the United States with the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1845 that allowed the United States to trade in 2 Japanese ports. And soon after this, other Western powers came and tried to force their way into Japan. And the Tokugawa shoguns were essentially forced to allow Western powers to trade in Japan. And within Japan, there was a lot of resistance to this. And by this point, the Tokugawa shogunate was several hundred years old. And a lot of people in Japan, especially in the Japanese government, started to consider resistance to the shogun. And this results in a major change in Japanese society called the Meiji Restoration. The emperor at the time, Emperor Mutsuhito, was supported by a few of his advisors in the samurai class, and soon they took control of the government and forced the shogun from power. Remember, by this point, the shogun, the military warlord, really controlled the country while the emperor was a figurehead. After the Meiji Restoration, this changes back to really a monarchy controlled by the emperor and his close advisors. And this restoration starts a period called the Meiji era. Meiji means enlightened because Mutsuhito saw an opportunity to try and modernize Japan. He had seen what was happening in China as the Chinese had fallen to Western spheres of influence. And to the Meiji emperor, the best way that Japan could resist Western influence was to modernize. So he sent out advisors to study in Germany, in Britain, in the United States, and elsewhere to figure out how Western countries operated. And he modeled Japanese society after what he saw around the world. He modernized the government, Japanese society, Japanese industry, and especially the military. And like other Western powers, he saw imperialism as a chance to kind of put Japan on the map and bring it into the modern era. So you start to see a series of efforts, military efforts by Japan to expand its territory. This started in 1895 with the Sino-Japanese War, where Japan seized territory in China. And remember, the Chinese at this point were still struggling to deal with modernization and Western influence. So despite China's very large size, Japan very handily defeated the Chinese. Later, there was the Russo-Japanese War. Russia, which was trying to gain its own imperial territory in Asia, came into conflict with Japan over the territory of Manchuria in what's today northern China. And despite the fact that Russia was, of course, a very large and increasingly westernized and modernized power, Japan was able to defeat the Russians, and in a treaty negotiated by President Roosevelt, gained Manchuria and parts of China from the Russians. And this was sort of seen as an upset because it was the first time a modern Asian nation was able to defeat a Western power in battle. And later in 1907, Japan annexed Korea. So within really a couple of decades, Japan went from being kind of a 16th century backwater to being a modern, growing imperial power. And this is going to have really serious consequences later in the 20th century as we get into the First and the Second World Wars. And it's important to kind of consider here how the major Asian powers in East Asia dealt with European and Western influence. Both Japan and China were very traditional, had their own values, and did resist Western imperialism. But China, which failed to modernize, very quickly was overrun by Western powers. Whereas Japan, which did modernize and industrialize, adapted to Western ways, modernized Japanese society, and was able to confront Western powers and maintain its own empire. So it's something to consider about how both China and Japan reacted to Western influence. Thanks for watching.